This is the story of the dykelands of the Maritimes, of the lowlands at the foot of Blomidon. Of the vast meadows called Grand Pré by the Acadians. Of Tantramar, named for the wild crying of the marsh birds. Of the lowlands all along the Fundy coast, and of the sea that creeps slowly over them. For centuries, the racing tides of the Bay of Fundy, swelled higher by the force of the Atlantic, have swept into Minas Basin, into Chignecto Bay, into the narrow river channels, and spilled over their banks, flooding thousands of acres. These are tides mud-colored with the rich silt they carry. Tides that rise sometimes 30 feet high, flooding the tidal rivers and drowning the lowlands. Tides that recede again, leaving behind them empty channels. Rich deposits of silt in the flats. And salt that kills all vegetation except coarse marsh grass and sedge. It takes from 1 to 4 years for rains to leach out the salt and turn the rich soil into fertile farmland. The Acadians settled here in 1632. This lowland area was like their homeland in Normandy. They knew how to shut out the sea. They built running dykes 5 feet high along shores and riverbanks. And gradually, once useless marshlands were turned into meadows and fields all along the Fundy coast. Ancient dykes and old roads over them still tell the story of the early French settlers who lived here until their expulsion in 1755. For a time, it was a lonely place. But the dykes held back the sea. Later, the British settled here. Many were from New England. They found these diked areas very productive. The higher land rising behind them they called the uplands. Here they built their homes. It was at Upper Burlington, Nova Scotia, that the forebears of Charlie Scott's family settled. Then, as now, orchards flourished on the uplands. The forests behind the farms were their woodlots, another source of natural wealth. For many years, upland and lowland farming prospered. Scott remembers when cattle raised on these lands were shipped to England until the English embargo in 1898. When dykeland hay sold for over $22 a ton. Times were good then. But cars and tractors replaced the ox and the horse. Hay was no longer an important cash crop. The land economy of this region changed. There was no money to repair dykes. They weakened. The sea broke through, and Scott watched it ruin his crops. He saw it killing valuable orchards, undermining buildings and public property, making traffic difficult, as at Upper Burlington. And at the town of Canning. But the land can be saved if a close watch is kept for breaks and the silt is cleared from the drains. Such repair jobs have been a community effort. But bad breaks like this require financial aid and machinery. Reclamation of these lands has now become a project of the Department of Agriculture in cooperation with the dike owners. Ice, strong winds, and high tides tore out this dike at Upper Burlington. Now they are building a new one. The dike shuts out the sea, but also cuts off the natural drainage of the river. To prevent the drainage being cut off, they build a sluice. In the center of the river, they lay a foundation of mud and brush for the sluice to lie on. They build the sluice of native trees, spruce and hemlock. Sanford, a dike builder, directs the men who hang the swinging gates near the outer end of the sluice. The rising tide closes these gates and shuts out the sea. The upper end of the sluice is left open. When the tide falls below the sluice level, the accumulated river drainage forces the gates open and so escapes. Over the top of the gates, they lay a protective plank covering. Now the sluice, ready to be set in place, is pushed into the river. The tide is at its highest now. The sluice can be floated downstream to take its place in the abattoir of the dike. But this takes time, and already the tide is running out. Tides, like time, wait for no man. This time the sluice has gone aground before reaching the site of the abattoir. But the next high tide floats it again. The tall stakes in the center of the channel show where the sluice will be set. Great skill is required in setting it, for the sluice must lie level on its bed. No time can be lost in anchoring the sluice before the tide rises again. Meanwhile, they build the wall of the dike to meet and cover the sluice. With confidence gained from experience, Sanford directs the construction of the abattoir. This is part of the dike system enclosing the sluice. It takes many loads of brush to strengthen the mud wall. Piece by piece, they lay the brush until a solid mattress is laid 2/3 the width of the abattoir. Hundreds of stakes are needed to build it firmly into the river bank. Then a layer of mud covers the brush. They lay alternate layers of brush and mud. Building out from each side of the river bank, the wall rises. It is slow work because each day the men are driven out for a time by the rising tide. But as the tide falls again, they continue to build up the mud and brush wall over the sluice. Machinery may replace horse and man labor in moving mud, but it still takes the skill of the hands of men to lay the brush and drive the stakes. A protective covering of brush is laid down below the sluice to protect the sluice from the force of the current. The work continues each day until the dike is high enough to shut out the tides. Now the Kennecook dike at Upper Burlington is finished. The incoming tide has raised the water very high, but this wall of brush and mud, wide enough for a road, holds back the sea. The tide water is 15 feet above the floor of the sluice. Sanford and his men have done a good job. In a few years, when the salt has leached out, these lands will again be perennial pastures, rich from silt deposits left by the sea. At Canning, heavier machinery is being used in the construction of the largest abattoir yet built in the Maritimes. Here, piling is driven as a bed for the 120-foot sluice. This one is set close to the river bank. Here, 3 heavy bronze gates will control the river drainage. The tide is out now, releasing the inward pressure on the gates, and the force of the river drainage from above is forcing the gates open. For the first time, brush is not being used in abattoir construction. A wood crib with a heavy rock fill is being used instead. For the first time, too, they are using much heavier spruce poles. The crib work is weighted with rocks instead of the usual mud fill. Gradually, a stout wall, this time with a core of rock and timber, rises above the level of the tide. On the inner side of the abattoir, they dump mud. This will cement together and make a watertight fill. This dike and abattoir at Canning is 60 feet wide. It serves as a highway, as well as protection from the sea. Today, reclaiming these dike lands is a rehabilitation plan of the provincial and federal governments. 70,000 acres have already been diked and reclaimed in the Maritimes. Still, thousands of acres of potential pasture lands are flooded daily by the tide. But when the tidal rivers are controlled like this one, the pasture lands are abundant. Land that will raise 4 tons of hay to the acre. And 78 bushels of grain. Lands that will support beef and dairy herds are worth reclaiming. Along the tidal rivers of Fundy lies a basis for a sound upland and dikeland farm economy. For some of the richest farmland in eastern Canada is right here by the sea.